Hello, and thank you for joining this session on philosophical perspectives in qualitative research. I'm excited to explore how these fundamental ideas shape the way we understand and conduct research. Our philosophical perspective is like a pair of glasses through which we view the research world. It colors everything we see and influences how we make sense of what we see. Today, we'll explore how these perspectives guide our entire research journey. Let me set up what we're going to cover in this session. We'll start by understanding what philosophical perspectives really mean in practice. These aren't just abstract ideas. They are practical frameworks that influence every decision we make as researchers. They determine what questions we think are worth pursuing or worth asking, how we go about finding the answers, what we consider valid evidence, and even how we interpret what we find. These perspectives are crucial because they affect everything from how we design our studies to how we analyze our findings. For example, if you believe there are multiple valid interpretations of reality, you might conduct an in-depth interview to capture different viewpoints about whatever you are investigating. If you believe in a single objective truth, you might take a different approach entirely. We'll be looking at the major philosophical perspectives that have shaped qualitative research over time. We'll try to understand their strengths and limitations, and most importantly, see how they apply to real-world research situations. Now, as I have indicated as part of the introduction, we are going to be exploring three major philosophical approaches that shape how we understand and conduct research. This is going to be a fascinating journey because we are going to be adopting different ways of seeing and understanding what reality is all about. We'll start with positivism. With positivism, here we can refer to it as being the grandfather of scientific research. Maybe, if you like, it is the approach that says if we can't measure it, then it doesn't exist. Think of scientists in laboratories who are running control experiments. In fact, what they are doing is basically positivism. That is positivism in real action. We also have what we call interpretivism, which takes a completely different angle. These researchers who rely on interpretivism, they look at reality from multiple perspectives. They consider human experience, and human experience isn't just something you can just measure, like the temperature of something or the weight of something. Interpretivists are interested in how people make sense of their world and how different people might see the same situation in completely different ways. Finally, we would also try to understand what we mean by critical realism. The critical realism is kind of like the middle ground that tries to bridge the approaches in terms of positivism and interpretivism. Critical realists generally say, yes, there's an objective reality out there, but our understanding of this objective reality is shaped by our social, historical, and even cultural context. For critical realists, they acknowledge that while gravity, say, may exist, how we study and understand it is influenced by our human perspectives about it. So what we're going to look at is where each of these approaches will give us different tools to try and understand the world around us. So we have to think of them as different lenses. Each one would help us see something unique and valuable in a different way. Throughout this session, we'll explore how these different perspectives shape the way we do research and what kind of research questions where one may use that may be suitable to answer the specific types of phenomena we are looking at. Now, building on the introduction I have provided, especially with regards to the first philosophical lens, positivism, let's think about it this way. First of all, let's try to use the image of the microscope as you see in the slide. This is not just a random choice. The microscope perfectly symbolizes what positivism is all about. It is about looking at things very closely, measuring them precisely, and leaving no room for guesswork. Let's break this down in a way. Let's break it down in a way that can connect to our everyday experience. So, for instance, when positivists say they want a scientific and empirical approach, they are basically saying that we should show them the evidence. It is like when you are buying a car, you don't just want the salesperson's words that it is great. You want to see the mileage the car has done, the performance statistics, and maybe the safety ratings of the car. The historical context is very, very fascinating when we are talking about positivism. Yes. So during the period of Enlightenment, there was this revolutionary shift in the way people thought about things. And imagine living in such a time when people started saying, maybe, hold on, we don't have to just accept what authorities tell us. We can test things for ourselves. And during the period of Enlightenment, asking questions was a big deal. So asking these questions during that time would be like people suddenly discovering that they needed to what? Fact check everything that was happening. Somewhere around the 19th century, this approach had taken off. It's interesting because this was also when the world was seeing huge technological advances, like the steam engine, industrial revolution, and what have you. People were seeing how scientific thinking could literally transform the world. What makes the positivist approach unique is that it insists on measurable what? Evidence. So a positive researcher is like a strict person who follows a written recipe. They believe that if we all follow the same exact steps, we should get to the same, or we should get to the same destination, or we should get the same results. So there's nothing like add a pinch of this, a pinch of that, or a pinch of no. So, in fact, positivism is not only about how things were looked at in ancient times. Positivism's influence is everywhere in modern research today. So every time you see, say, for instance, a clinical trial being done, maybe for a new medicine, or a statistical analysis is being done to try and understand some market trends, this basically involves positivism in action. Now, to try and understand positivism very well, I just want to take us a little bit back and draw our attention to the originators of this particular school of thought. So let me bring Auguste Comte and the birth of positivism to life in a way that will really explain why it was so revolutionary during their time. So basically, just imagine Paris in the early 1800s, and Europe was buzzing with new ideas. The Industrial Revolution was transforming the society then. And then here was Auguste Comte asking some real radical questions about how we know what we know. Essentially, this was a person who said, let's stop speculating and start proving. Instead of speculating, everything should be what? Should be proven. What made Comte so special was how he challenged the way people thought about knowledge. Before him, a lot of understanding was based on tradition, authority, or religious explanations. It was Comte who came along and basically said that it's not good enough. We always have to show what? Show evidence. So his empirical focus was like introducing a new pair of glasses to the world of research. And he insisted that we should only trust what we can observe and measure. Okay. So in terms of modern terms, Combs' approach will be like fact-checking process. Everything on social media these days, before we accept it as being true, we can try to do what? Fact-check it. So nothing gets through without solid, observable evidence when we're dealing with positivism. Now, the key points when we are talking about positivism are empirical observation, objectivity, and then methodology. Let me help break down these key points of positivism in a way that really connects with our everyday experience. First, think about, let's look at empirical observation as a first key point. Empirical observation isn't just about looking at things, it is about looking at things in a very, very specific way. So imagine you are buying a car. A positive researcher wouldn't care about how the car makes you feel. They would want to know the exact fuel efficiency in terms of numbers, the precise acceleration times, the specific safety rating, and all that. Everything must be measurable and verifiable when we are talking about positivist researchers. Now, let's look at the second key point, objectivity. Objectivity is a fascinating point because it's actually harder than it sounds. When we talk about value neutrality, we are talking about something incredibly challenging but crucial. It's like being a referee in a sports match. You might have a favorite team, but you have to put that aside and completely judge only what is actually happening, what you are seeing, what you see happening in the field. The emphasis on deductive reasoning in hypothesis testing is like solving a puzzle. You start with a big idea, which is your hypothesis, and then you systematically test whether it holds true or not. Okay. Now, the last one, methodology. The methodology aspect ties everything together. Positivists love quantitative research methods because they give us concrete, measurable results. It's like having a toolbox where everything has a specific purpose. Surveys, we can conduct surveys to collect the data, experiment to test causes and effects, and maybe statistical analysis to understand patterns. Now, despite the positive sides of positivist research and the key points I have highlighted, let's explain some critiques of positivism in a way, and we'll do it in a way that shows why they matter for real-world research. Think about something as complex as workplace culture. A positivist approach might measure things like productivity rates, attendance numbers, satisfaction scores, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10. But this is where it gets interesting and potentially problematic. Let's say you have two departments with identical satisfaction scores of maybe 8 over 10. On paper, they look the same for the two departments. But what if in one department, the people are genuinely happy, while in the other, they are just afraid to give negative feedback because of the environment? This means that the numbers alone cannot tell you that story. And this is what the critics mean when they say positivism oversimplifies complex social phenomena. Then there's also the issue of ignoring subjective experiences and contextual nuances. The criticism about this particular fact is equally very crucial. Think about studying something like immigration. A positivist approach might count numbers of immigrants and then measure economic impacts, track employment rates, and what have you. But it might miss the human stories behind the immigration, the hopes, the fears, challenges, and personal journeys that shape the real experience of immigration. These critiques don't mean positivism is wrong. Please note, they are just highlighting its limitations. Now, the next philosophy I want us to look at is interpretivism. Interpretivism takes a fundamentally different approach to understanding our world as compared to what we just discussed with positivism. So think of interpretivism as being more like a skilled documentary filmmaker rather than a laboratory scientist. Whilst positivists want to measure and count, interpretivists want to understand the story behind the numbers. They are interested in the why and the how of what? Of human experience. The concept of meaning making is very central to the positivists. Let me give you a practical example. Imagine studying how people use social media. A positivist might count the number of posts or measure engagement rates. But an interpretivist will ask, what does social media mean to different people? How do they use it to construct their social reality? Why do they choose to share what they share? When we talk about the subjective understanding of people in terms of interpretivist research, we are acknowledging that different people might experience the same situation in completely different ways. It's like reading a book. When you read a book, 10 different people might have 10 different interpretations when they read a book, and all of them could be valid within their own context. So the connection to qualitative research is very crucial here. Instead of surveys with predetermined answers, interpretivists might conduct in-depth interviews, maybe observe people in their natural settings, or analyze personal narratives. Here, interpretivists are looking for rich, detailed descriptions that help us understand human experience in all its complexity. So for the interpretivist approach, it becomes particularly valuable in the social sciences because it recognizes that human behavior about isn't just about cause and effect. It's about meaning, context, and interpretations. Okay. Now let me explain interpretivism in detail using this parable. Let's use this parable, the parable of the blind man and the elephant. I'll explain why this parable of the blind man and the elephant is such a perfect illustration of interpretivism's core principles. Think about what's happening in this image. Each person is touching a different part of the elephant and coming to their own conclusion about what it is. Here is the fascinating part. They are all simultaneously right and wrong. They are right about what they are experiencing, but they are wrong in terms of their thinking, their experience, and in terms of their thinking. Their experience represents the whole truth. This perfectly captures what interpretivism is all about, especially when we talk about subjective understanding and meaning making. Each person in the parable is making meaning based on their direct experience. The one touching the trunk feels something snake-like. The one touching the side feels something wall-like, and so on. None of them is lying or mistaken about what they are experiencing. Their interpretations make perfect sense, especially within their context. Now let's connect this to research. Let's connect this to research. When interpretivists study social phenomena, they recognize that different people might experience the same reality in different ways. Just like with the elephant, no single perspective tells the whole story of the elephant. For example, if we are studying organizational change in an organizational setting, leadership might see it as a strategic progress when we're talking about organizational change. The middle level managers might experience it as an increased workload, whereas the frontline workers might feel it as an uncertainty about their jobs, and customers might perceive it as changes in service quality. Here, each perspective here is valid and contributes to our understanding of the whole picture. And this is why interpretivism emphasizes that when we are dealing with it, we have to gather multiple perspectives, and we have to be deep, and we have to provide rich description of our experiences in terms of the context, and acknowledge that truth can be what? Can be multi-layered. Now, let's use another image to try and explain interpretivism. The image brilliantly captures another key principle of interpretivism, and it's particularly relevant to how we understand organizations and business environments. Look at the image. One person sees a 6, another sees a 9, and they are both absolutely correct from where they are standing. Now, let's look at this too. This is an optical illusion of steps, where one person sees 3 steps, another sees 4. And this brilliantly illustrates another critical aspect of interpretivist research, particularly in organizational settings. Now, in terms of the origin and founders of interpretivism, we'll look at it in a way that can bring interpretivism to life, so that we can show why, how they thought of it and why they are still incredibly relevant today. Think about why interpretivism emerged. It is actually quite a dramatic story in the history of social science research. Here were all these researchers trying to study human behavior like they were studying physics or chemistry, and something just wasn't working. It's like they had a fantastic camera, but were only taking black and white photos of a vibrant, colorful world. The University of Chicago became this incredible hub of new thinking in the early 1900s. Imagine the excitement as researchers started developing new ways to understand human behavior. Instead of just counting and measuring, they began asking questions like, what does this actually mean to the people involved? Mill and Cooley's contribution was revolutionary during this period. They showed us that meaning isn't just sitting down or sitting there waiting to be discovered. It's created through our interactions. So think about something as simple as business meeting. The same meeting might mean opportunity to one person. It may appear as a threat to another, and a routine to a third person. These meanings aren't fixed. They are negotiated through our interactions. Later on came Max Weber with his concept of Verstehen, which basically referred to the concept of understanding. He was saying that, look, if you want to understand why people do what they do, you need to see the world through their eyes. It is not enough to observe just behavior. We need to understand the meaning behind the behavior people put up. And this was a game changer. For example, imagine studying customer loyalty. A positivist might count repeat purchases, but Weber would want us to understand what loyalty actually meant to customers or means to customers. Why do they come back? What's their relationship with the brand? Or what does it mean to them? This shift from measuring to understanding completely transformed how we approach research. Now, let's look at some key points or key principles of interpretivism. I want us to spend some time to understand this very well. First, let's talk about subjective reality. Unlike positivism, interpretivism recognizes that reality isn't fixed. It is constructed by people based on how they interpret their experiences. So think about how different people might interpret the same event completely differently based on their background or their culture or experiences. That's why we as researchers need to explore multiple perspectives and understand the rich context behind people's interpretations. Now, the second in understanding the interpretivism is the concept of understanding. In interpretivist research, we are not just observing from the outside. We are also trying to truly emphasize with our, we are also trying to truly empathize with our participants, especially in terms of their experiences. So how do we see the world? What meanings do they attach to their actions? We use inductive reasoning here, especially. Instead of starting with the hypothesis, we let patterns and theories emerge from our observations and interactions. And then the final thing is methodology. Interpretivism relies heavily on qualitative methods. especially interviews, case studies, and maybe ethnography. We use these methods because they allow us to get tick descriptions. And the tick descriptions here basically refer to detailed, rich accounts that can capture or that captures the complexity of what? Of social phenomena. So when we are talking about interpretivism, it is not just about what people do, but why they do it, what it means to them, and how they understand it. Despite these key points that expatiates on interpretivism, it faces some criticisms. And I'll address these criticisms of interpretivism in a way that really will tell us why the debate matters for real-world research. So think about the scales of justice in the image. It's quite fitting because we are weighing different approaches to understanding reality. The critics have some valid points, but let's unpack them carefully. The first criticism about scientific rigor and generalizability is interesting. Yes, if you study how employees at one tech startup experiences organizational change, you can't necessarily say that all tech startups will have the same experience. But here's the thing, and here's the question you may ask. Should that be our goal? Sometimes understanding one context deeply can provide insights that numbers alone cannot reveal. Let me try and give a concrete example. When maybe a coffee shop, say Starbucks, some time ago was trying to understand why some stores perform better than others, pure metrics. When I say pure metrics, I'm looking at the metrics in terms of a positivist approach. The metrics showed part of the picture, and the part of the picture was sales, foot traffic, etc. But it took interpretivist research to understand how different store managers created their store cultures to reveal the crucial insights about customer experience and employee engagement. Then there's also the criticism about causal relationships. Now, this one is fascinating. Critics say interpretivism can't definitely prove that A causes B. That's true. It cannot. But in complex situations, in complex social situations, is simple causation even realistic? It's not. For instance, take employee motivation for us an instance. Can we really say that X definitely causes Y when dealing with human beings with different backgrounds, especially with different backgrounds, different values and experiences? No, we can't say that. However, these limitations don't invalidate the interpretivist approach. They instead suggest that different research questions will need different approaches. Complex social phenomena might need multiple research methods and what have you. Now, the last one we're going to consider is critical realism. Critical realism is so exciting and a practical approach to research. And we want to use these three in the picture as a metaphor to explain it. Critical realism was developed by the philosopher Roy Bashkar in the late 20th century. He realized that researchers were stuck in some kind of tug of war between pure objectivity and pure subjectivity. And then he thought that there must be a better way. And then he came up with the concept of critical realism. And that critical realism is that better way. Now let's use this three diagram to really understand how it works. Imagine you are studying employee burnout in organizations, employee fatigue in organizations. At the empirical level, and that is the branches and the leaves, these are things we can directly observe and measure. So if we are studying employee burnout, the things we can see, directly observe and measure are absenteeism rates, performance metrics, and then maybe other survey responses. But in actual fact, at the actual level, that is the trunk level, these are events that happen whether we observe them or not. There will be some events like that. Whether we observe them or not, they will happen. For instance, workplace interactions. whether they are absenteeism or not. When people, one or two people come, there will be workplace interactions. Decision-making processes are also a constant. Information or informal communications are also a constant. Then we have the last bit, the roots. And the roots are what we refer to as the real level. These are the deeper causal mechanisms. So in terms of organizational, in terms of what we are looking at, employee burnout in organizations, the deeper causal mechanisms may be the power structures, economic pressures, and maybe societal expectations about people's work. Now, interestingly, what makes this approach so powerful is that it acknowledges all these levels and that all these levels matter. Then, so basically, it is saying that, yes, we can measure sick days and productivity as part of the empirical, but we need to understand the underlying organizational dynamics as the actual, and then the deeper structural issues as the real to understand burnout. This is why critical realism is particularly valuable for studying complex organizational problems. It tells us one thing, that yes, measure what you can, but don't stop there. You need to dig deeper to understand the underlying mechanisms. Now, the key points when we are talking about critical realism are that we have different layers of reality. And as I have explained, reality consists of three layers: the empirical, the actual, and then the real reality. Then there's also the issue of the dialectic approach. The dialectic approach is very fascinating because it says that we need to constantly move between these layers to understand what's really going on. It's not enough to just collect data. We need to ask questions like why. We need to ask how at each level. And that's where retroduction also comes into play. It's like being a detective who uses both the evidence in front of you, that's deduction, and then creative thinking about possible explanations, and that's induction. So you use both to be able to solve a case. Now, the last bit, methodology. The methodology piece is also very crucial because it acknowledges that no single research method can capture all these levels we are talking about. You might need surveys and method and other metrics for the empirical layer. You may need interviews and observations for the actual layer. Maybe you may need historical analysis and maybe some theories for the real layer. Now, let's look at some critiques of what? The critical realism. Yes. Let's break it down. The first issue is about the issue of complexity. Now, there's a complexity challenge, and the complexity challenge is real and very critical. Imagine studying something like organizational innovation. You need quantitative data on patents and maybe new products, which may be seen as an empirical layer. You also would need to understand team dynamics and knowledge sharing in the organization, and that is the actual layer. You may also need to grasp market forces and organizational culture. That is the real layer. So the balance between the empirical evidence, theoretical insight is equally challenging. And maybe if we take the example of studying workplace well-being, hard data shows that attendance rates and productivity, it will show that's the hard data. But understanding why these patterns exist requires theoretical frameworks about organizational behavior. So finding the sweet spot between the data and the theory can be like walking a tightrope. So, however, there are practical ways we can address some of these challenges by using maybe a phased research approach, like tackle different layers sequentially rather than simultaneously, or maybe build research teams with complementary skills, or even start with focus questions that can be expanded as understanding develops. So we can, or maybe we can just try to rely on theoretical frameworks to guide empirical investigations and not replace it with some, and not try to replace it. Now, that brings us to the end of the explanation, but I also want us to take some time to explain some critical aspects, like the issue of ontology, because you cannot understand the philosophical assumptions or foundations without understanding what ontology is. So let me explain why ontology is fundamental to understanding organizations, even though it might sound a bit abstract. Now, think about this. Before you can study anything, you need to understand what that thing actually is. And that's what ontology helps us to figure out. It's like having a map before starting a journey. You need to know what kind of terrain you are dealing with. So let me make this concrete with some example of maybe organizational power. A positivist ontology might view power as something measurable, like the number of direct reports or budget control, whilst the interpretivist ontology might see power as something constructed through relationships and perceptions. For the critical realists, their ontology will look at both the visible manifestations of power and the underlying structures that creates it. Okay. Now, there's this phrase that the fabric of organizational reality in the slide, and it's particularly interesting. Just like fabric has both visible patterns and underlying structure that gives its strength. Organizations have visible elements like policies, hierarchies, and what have you. And they also have invisible elements like relationships and cultural norms, power dynamics. But there would also be underlying structures that hold all of it together. And this matters important in practice. Okay. Now, let me explain some two layers of organizational reality and how they interact, and why understanding both of them is crucial for anyone who is studying management or managing organizations. So think about a major organizational change like implementing a new technology system. We can have what we call objective reality, and then we can also have subjective reality. In this particular instance, objective reality will include the actual software that's being installed, the training hours that are scheduled, and then any other metrics that may be measurable. But there will also be subjective reality, where some employees will see it as a threat will see the implementation of the technology as a threat to their job security. Others will see it as an opportunity for skill development. And we can also have a combination of this, especially when we are talking about critical realism. We can have an interplay of objective and subjective reality. Now, these two realities can actually work together in organizations. They can work together like maybe like dance partners, constantly moving and influencing each other. Okay. Now, let's explore how people in organizations collectively create and interpret their reality. Maybe you can think of your organization's culture as a story we are all writing together in the organization. Through daily interactions, shared language, and common experiences, we are constantly creating what we refer to as meaning. So when a company says we are like a family or we are disrupting the industry, these aren't just phrases they are saying. They become part of how everyone understands their workplace. Sense making, therefore, is particularly fascinating during big changes. So maybe during a merger, for instance, different teams might interpret the same announcement completely differently based on their past experiences. Some might see it as an opportunity, whilst others might fear that it may lead to what? It may lead to job losses. Then there's also two fundamentally different ways of seeing and studying the world. Think of these two as two different pairs of glasses through which researchers view reality. So, as we have indicated already, so for instance, the positivists would have an ontological stance that is objective in terms of measurable metrics, and they will always follow universal laws. And usually they use quantitative methods. And we have the interpretivist approach, where reality is usually subjective, and they follow qualitative methods. Now, let's look at something really fascinating again, how we understand and study the world around us. First, let's break down what we refer to as epistemology. Epistemology basically deals with knowledge and how we know, and in terms of validity too. So how we understand and study the world around us is very important. So think of epistemology as the science of knowing. Epistemology is all about understanding how we come to know things and how we can be confident that what we are doing or what we are knowing is valid. So when we are talking about epistemology, issues regarding consistency is absolutely crucial, especially even in research generally. So for instance, imagine building a house. You wouldn't want to mix blueprints from different architectural styles, right? The same goes for research. We need to make sure our fundamental beliefs about reality, that's our ontology, they match with how we try to study it. So our ontology should match with how we try to study the reality. And that is our epistemology. And then comes the next thing on the flip side, we can look at the methodology. So let me just make a point. If you are more of an interpretivist who believes that reality is socially constructed and subjective, you would probably lean towards qualitative methods. This might involve interviews, observations, and we have mentioned this. So sometimes you can have the best of both, maybe positivist and what? Interpretive. It's like having both a microscope and a telescope. Different tools that give you different perspective on the same phenomenon. Now, there are some practical considerations we may consider. Let me explain how these practical considerations come together to create a robust research that truly captures organizational reality. So let's think about researching something like remote work effectiveness. So your ontological stance will shape every step. So for instance, in terms of research questions, a positivist might ask, what is the impact of remote work on measurable productivity? Whilst the interpretivist would ask, how do employees make sense of their remote work experience? The same thing may apply when we are looking at the issues of sampling. Sampling is also fascinating because it is also layered. It can be layered in terms of maybe individual level, group level, and then organizational level. Okay, then we also have the issue of data collection. Data collection methods must always match with our philosophical stance. So for instance, if you are using a positivist philosophy, you may be interested in quantitative data, performance metrics, time tracking data, and whatnot. If you are interpretivist, you are using in-depth interviews to look deeper into things. If you are a critical realist, you can combine both maybe surveys with contextual analysis for your data analysis. Yeah. So for data analysis, quantitative methods might track maybe productivity metrics, whereas qualitative analysis might explore maybe emerging themes, and then mixed method might connect the statistical patterns with maybe employee narratives. All of what we are doing has got ethical implications. It has got ethical implications. This goes beyond just following ethical guidelines. It's deeply about respecting and acknowledging different ways of seeing and understanding the world. So let's talk about maybe participant perspective first. This is interesting because we need to remember that our research participants might view reality very differently from us. For example, if you are studying maybe traditional healing practices, you need to respect that some participants might have a completely different understanding of how health and healing work than Western medicine may do. It's not about judging which view is right. It's about respecting and acknowledging these different beliefs as valid within their context. Then there's also the issue of reflexivity. Yeah, so reflexivity basically is about turning the lens back on ourselves as researchers. We need to be honest about how our own beliefs and assumptions might be coloring our research. If I believe strongly in maybe quantitative methods, I might unconsciously dismiss or undervalue qualitative insights. Or if I come from a particular cultural background, I might interpret behaviors through that specific lens without even realizing it. So sometimes we have to think about wearing think about it like wearing some colored glasses. We need to be aware of the maybe tints in it through which we are viewing our research. Our own ontological assumptions are like those glasses. They affect everything we see and how we interpret it. So I want to emphasize that this self-awareness is very important because it helps us to conduct more ethical more inclusive research. Now, as we wrap up, let's bring everything together with some key takeaways that really capture the essence of what we are discussing here. First, let's talk about the holistic approach. Think of research like weaving a tapestry. The threads of ontology and methodology are completely intertwined. So when we are working, we need to choose our research methods very carefully. It is crucial to pick ones that align with our philosophical stance. If you believe reality is objective and measurable, your methods should reflect that. If you believe reality is socially constructed and subjective, your approach needs to honor that perspective. It is all about creating a coherent and consistent research strategy. I also want to emphasize continuous learning. So as researchers, we have to stay open to evolving ontological perspectives. So because research isn't static, and neither should our perspectives be. So we need to stay open to new ways of understanding reality and knowing the truth. So we always have to think about it like maybe we have to keep our minds open, wide open, so that fresh breezes or fresh ideas can come true. Thank you very much.